Ji-Hyun Park was just 19 when her life was sold. Han Joon, the most dangerous mafia boss in Korea, held the city and her future in his hands. What began as a debt her father could not pay became a dark, twisted story of survival, power, and a forbidden bond that no one could have predicted. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hum of neon lights flickering across the narrow streets of Seoul. Hidden behind the city's bright facade, a man sat hunched over a small wooden table, his trembling hands clutching a stack of worthless cards. The smell of smoke and cheap alcohol filled the air. But what weighed heavier was the crushing sense of loss. He had gambled away everything: his savings, his business, his dignity. Debt collectors had already taken the house and the car, leaving only shadows where his family once felt safe. Yet instead of walking away, he chased one more game, believing fortune might forgive him. But fate was never kind to men like him. Each card he laid down pushed him deeper into ruin. Around him, sharp-eyed men in dark suits watched closely, their expressions unreadable but their silence threatening. These were not ordinary gamblers. They were foot soldiers of a syndicate that ruled the underworld. They had no need for police, no use for judges. Their rules were written in blood, and debts owed to them were collected without mercy. By the time the game ended, he was broken, staring at a ledger filled with numbers he could never repay. The men didn't raise their voices or brandish weapons. They didn't need to. Their stillness carried enough menace to make him sweat. He pleaded, promising to pay back what he owed, if only they gave him more time. But time was the one thing he no longer had. The syndicate had grown impatient with his excuses, and his name had been whispered to their boss, a man whose reputation stretched across borders, known for his cruelty, feared even by rival gangs. He was a figure who thrived on loyalty and fear. When he wanted something, he got it. And when someone failed him, the punishment was worse than death. That night, as the debtors left him with a warning, the man realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to run. He had nothing left to offer. No money, no property, no future. Only one thing remained, and it was the thing he should have protected most. His daughter. She was young, innocent, and unaware of the danger creeping closer every day. She worked quietly, took care of her father, and believed his troubles would soon pass. But in the twisted logic of the underworld, innocence carried its own value. The whispers started small. The cruel suggestion passed between collectors. The daughter could erase the debt, not in money but in flesh and obedience. It was an offer unspoken at first, but soon it became a demand. The man's shame was unbearable, yet desperation drowned out his conscience. The day the syndicate returned, he no longer resisted. His eyes were hollow as he nodded to their terms. She was no longer his to protect. In that moment she became currency, a payment handed over to buy his own survival. What he did not know was that this bargain would chain her to a world more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the windows of the small apartment, as if the sky itself was mourning what was about to happen. The young woman sat quietly, unaware of the deal her father had already sealed. She thought the knocking at the door was just another visit from men demanding money, the kind that came often and left her trembling in corners. But this time was different. When the door opened, the sight that greeted her was far more terrifying than anything she had known before. A sleek black car waited outside, its engine humming like a predator at rest. Standing in the doorway were men in tailored suits, their eyes cold and sharp, their movements precise, leaving no room for questions. Her father could not meet her gaze. His silence was the loudest betrayal she had ever heard. They didn't drag her or shout threats. Instead, they simply gestured for her to follow, and something in their stillness told her resistance was useless. She felt the weight of unseen chains tighten around her, forcing her to step outside into the rain. The car door opened with quiet finality, and as she was guided inside, the air shifted. The leather seats smelled of wealth, yet the atmosphere was suffocating. heavy with the presence of someone far more dangerous than the men who had come for her. Sitting at the far end of the car was the man who would decide her future, the boss. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but it carried an aura of command that no words could capture. Everything about him radiated control, the way he leaned back without fear, the way his eyes studied her as if she were a puzzle to be solved, the way silence bent itself around him. Rumors had painted him as a man capable of extreme cruelty, a leader who crushed rivals without hesitation and dealt with betrayal by erasing entire bloodlines. She had never imagined standing so close to him, much less belonging to him. In that instant, she realized what her father had done. He had traded her life for his own. The ride felt endless, the city lights blurring past as her heart pounded against her ribs. She wanted to cry, scream, beg to be released, but the quiet inside the car told her those things would only bring punishment. Instead, she stared at her trembling hands, fighting the urge to collapse. Every turn of the vehicle carried her farther from the life she had known, deeper into a future she could not escape. When the car finally stopped, she was led into a towering building that seemed to pierce the clouds. The marble floors gleamed, and guards lined the hallways with military precision. Everything spoke of power, wealth, and danger. She was taken to a high-rise penthouse, its windows revealing the endless sprawl of Seoul beneath. It should have been breathtaking, but to her it felt like a prison cell suspended in the sky. The boss did not need to explain what she was now. His silence carried the message clearly. She was no longer free, no longer a daughter, no longer her own person. She was property, purchased not with money, but with fear. Her life had been signed away in a single night, and now, every breath she took belonged to the most dangerous man in Korea. The first days inside the penthouse were disorienting. It was a place that sparkled with wealth, filled with glass walls, velvet chairs and chandeliers that glowed like captured stars. To anyone else, it would have looked like paradise, but to her it was nothing more than a gilded cage. Every corner whispered of surveillance. Every step echoed with the quiet footsteps of guards who shadowed her without fail. Freedom was no longer measured in open doors but in the illusion of choice. She could wander the rooms, eat from golden plates, even wear dresses finer than anything she had touched before. But the knowledge that none of it was hers poisoned the luxury. The boss rarely spoke in those first days. His presence was enough to shape the air around her. He would appear in the evenings, stepping into the room like a shadow carved from stone. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, yet the silence he carried pressed down harder than shouting ever could. She would sit across from him at the long dining table, the sound of cutlery filling the silence, her appetite shrinking under his gaze. He did not treat her cruelly, but his indifference cut deeper. It was as if she were a puzzle piece taken from another box, out of place yet kept close because he wanted it that way. In her solitude, she studied him. The world knew him as a monster, a man who had carved an empire from fear. But here he moved with patience. He studied documents late into the night, took phone calls in hushed tones, and met with men who left with fear in their eyes. Violence hovered near him like a shadow, but he never brought it into her presence. He gave her space, but it was not freedom, it was control disguised as kindness. At night when she lay in the vast unfamiliar bed, she thought of her father. Anger burned inside her, but beneath it was sorrow too deep to put into words. She had been traded like a possession, stripped of choice, abandoned by the one person who should have protected her most. Yet even as the grief tore at her, she could not deny the strange aura of the man who now held her life in his hands. He was not like the drunk gamblers she had seen ruin themselves in smoky halls, nor like the thugs who had come to their door. He was something else, something more dangerous, calm, precise, and unreadable. Days stretched into weeks, and she realized the boss was not keeping her hidden. He began to take her with him into carefully chosen spaces, private dinners, exclusive clubs, rooms filled with men who bowed their heads when he entered. She was placed at his side, silent, like an ornament that told a story no one dared ask about. Fear kept her spine straight, but curiosity grew in her heart. Why her? Why had he chosen to keep her so close, when he could have discarded her as easily as a coin tossed away? The question lingered like a storm on the horizon, unanswered, heavy, and impossible to ignore. The true extent of his world revealed itself slowly, like layers of darkness peeling back to show sharper, more gangsterous edges. She followed him into meetings held in dimly lit offices, where men in tailored suits argued in low voices over deals that carried consequences far beyond money. Papers were signed, briefcases exchanged, and phones rang with coded messages. Behind the polished facades, threats lingered in the air like smoke, and every nod, every gesture could decide a man's life or death. Violence was not always visible, but its presence was undeniable. She began to understand that the empire around her was built on fear, loyalty enforced by unspoken rules, and the ability to strike without warning. She learned quickly that survival in this world required observation, patience, and restraint. A misstep, a glance, or even a word could bring catastrophe. Guards moved in calculated silence, always watching, and she understood that their loyalty was not to her, but to him. Even in luxurious rooms filled with opulence, she felt exposed, constantly aware that danger lurked in every corner. The boss watched her too, studying her reactions with an intensity that made her uneasy. He was assessing her, learning her limits, predicting her thoughts, and in a way that made her feel like prey and confidant at the same time. She began to witness the full measure of his power. Rival gangs had dared to challenge him in small ways, only to vanish or reappear broken. One night a shipment of illegal goods arrived late, and the men responsible were brought before him. They trembled as he walked toward them, silent and deliberate. By the time he spoke, the fear in the room was suffocating. Punishments were swift, precise, and merciless. She realized she was learning more than just about his empire. She was learning about control, dominance, and the way fear could be used as a tool to shape behavior. Yet, amid the brutality, there were moments that confused her. He treated her with care, placing her at his side during gatherings where no one else dared speak directly to her. His instructions were measured, his protection evident, yet there was no warmth, no familiarity, just a rigid structure of ownership that somehow felt personal. It was a contradiction she could not resolve. She feared him as she feared death, but she also began to feel the pull of curiosity, the compulsion to understand why he kept her close instead of discarding her as he had discarded countless others. Even in the midst of danger, he never harmed her. His empire could have crushed her with a word, yet he chose to observe, to place her within his orbit rather than away from it. She began to realize that survival here meant more than obedience. It meant understanding the rules of a world she had been thrust into overnight, and the deeper she observed, the more she understood that she was not just a pawn, but a silent witness to a power that few could comprehend. A power that demanded loyalty, fear, and an acceptance of a life that no longer belonged to her alone. The night air was thick with tension, carrying the distant sounds of sirens and muffled voices. But inside the penthouse, it was almost completely silent. She had grown used to the hum of the city below, the quiet footfalls of guards, and the subtle movements that signaled the presence of someone important. But that evening, something was different. The boss had received word of a rival gang plotting against him, and the normally controlled atmosphere had shifted. Every gesture, every glance, carried the weight of potential violence. She could feel it in her bones. Danger was coming, and there was no escaping it. The attack came without warning. Men stormed the building, masked and armed, breaking through doors and shattering glass. Explosions and gunfire tore through the hallways, and the sound of shattered luxury filled the air. She ducked behind a velvet chair, heart hammering, as bullets tore into walls mere inches from where she cowered. Chaos consumed the penthouse, and she realized that the safety she had felt, even if it was illusory, had vanished in an instant. Her pulse raced, and every instinct screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, and the weight of that realization made her feel as fragile as a bird caught in a storm. When the smoke cleared, he emerged. Blood streaked his suit, cuts on his face but eyes as sharp and unreadable as ever. His calm, almost predatory demeanor, amidst the carnage, was terrifying. The men who had dared to attack him lay unconscious or fleeing, and she realized just how ruthless he could be when provoked. In that moment, the stories she had heard about his cruelty and precision were no longer rumors, they were reality, more horrifying than anything she had imagined. Yet amidst the fear, she noticed something else. He had come for her first, scanning the room until his gaze locked on hers, ensuring she was unharmed. His power was absolute, but so was his protection, at least for her. After the attack, the penthouse was a mess of broken glass, bloodstains and overturned furniture. She was shaking, too stunned to move, but he remained composed, moving through the destruction with a focus that was almost otherworldly. In the aftermath, he did something she did not expect. For the first time, he spoke to her, not with orders or instructions, but with words that revealed a glimpse of humanity. He explained, in his own way, why she was kept close. She reminded him of someone he had lost long ago, someone he had loved and never forgot. That connection, fragile and hidden beneath layers of fear and control, was the reason she had survived. The revelation both terrified and bewildered her. She had been living in a world ruled by fear, yet now she saw that beneath the darkness there were traces of a complicated humanity. She understood that survival in this world was not just about obeying rules or hiding from danger. It was about understanding the layers of loyalty, loss, and personal history that shaped the most feared man in Korea. And for the first time she felt the strange, unsettling pull of empathy mixed with fear. A dangerous combination she could neither resist nor fully understand. Time moved differently inside the penthouse. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched into long hours of quiet observation. Fear, which had once been her constant companion, began to evolve into something more complicated. She no longer flinched at every step, nor did she tremble at every glance. Instead, she began to notice patterns, gestures, and small behaviors that revealed the man behind the reputation. He was still the same ruthless mafia boss who commanded loyalty and inspired terror, but there were moments when he allowed glimpses of vulnerability to seep through the cracks. These glimpses unsettled her, making her heart race in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. He had his rules and she had hers now. Rules for survival. Yet despite the rigid structure that kept her in place, she began to recognize subtle acts of protection. When she moved through dangerous areas, guards shifted to shield her path. When rival gangs whispered threats in hidden corners of the city, he acted with swift precision to eliminate them before they could reach her. It was a paradox she could not reconcile. He was the embodiment of danger, and yet he had become her shield. The same hands that dealt death could also create a fragile sense of safety. Her emotions grew conflicted. She hated him for the world he had forced her into, for the life he had taken from her, for the father who had traded her like currency. Yet she could not deny the strange allure of his presence. Fear mixed with fascination, creating a knot of emotions she could neither untangle nor control. She watched him closely, learning the subtleties of his power, the way he read a room, predicted actions, and commanded attention without raising his voice. The more she understood him, the more complicated her feelings became. It was impossible to hate someone whose very being dominated the world around her, yet impossible to trust someone whose hands had created so much pain. She noticed other things too, small kindnesses, hidden within strict control. He ensured she ate, slept well, was not exposed to unnecessary danger. When she faltered under the weight of her fear, he did not punish her, he observed, waiting for her to regain composure. There was a pattern in his behavior, a rhythm that allowed her to anticipate his actions, and in some ways, it gave her a fragile sense of stability. The more she saw, the more she realized that survival here was not merely about obedience. It was about understanding, about reading the lines between power and care, threat and protection, cruelty and restraint. Her internal struggle intensified when she began to sense his attention shifting in ways that were not purely protective. He observed her with an intensity that suggested fascination, an interest that went beyond control. It made her uneasy, yet part of her could not look away. She was caught between fear and reluctant attachment, trapped in a world where danger and intimacy intertwined. The realization terrified her. The bond forming between them was dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to escape. And yet in the silence of those long nights, she understood that she had crossed an invisible line. Fear was no longer the only thing holding her close. Whispers began to circulate through the city, whispers that carried danger like smoke through the streets. Rival gangs had learned of her presence and began plotting to use her as leverage against him. Every shadow seemed to move with intent, every passerby a potential threat. She realized that her life had become a chess piece in a game far larger than she could comprehend. Fear returned, sharper and colder than before, because this time, survival was not guaranteed by proximity. It depended on action, courage, and the choice she was about to make. She discovered the plot late one night, while moving through the penthouse. A misdelivered message, an intercepted call, and fragments of conversation revealed the plan. She was to be kidnapped, used as a bargaining chip to strike at the heart of his empire. Her pulse raced, and she understood immediately that the danger was imminent. There was no time to hesitate, no safe corner to hide in. She could either escape and save herself, leaving him to face the wrath of his enemies, or warn him, stepping further into the world that had already ensnared her. Both choices carried lethal consequences, and she felt the weight of her life, and his, pressing down on her shoulders like stone. For hours, she moved silently through the building, avoiding the guards whose loyalty was unquestionable, yet whose presence now felt suffocating. Every step had to be calculated, precise. A misstep could cost her everything. Her mind raced as she debated the impossible choice, self-preservation or allegiance. In the end, instinct guided her. She could not allow the enemies to exploit her. She could not become the instrument of his downfall. She chose him. She chose to act. The warning she delivered was subtle yet enough. Through coded signals, hidden notes, and carefully arranged information, she settled him to the imminent threat. The Mafia boss, known for his ruthless efficiency, immediately understood the danger. Within minutes, he mobilized his inner circle, preparing for the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in the penthouse. She watched from a hidden vantage point, her heart hammering, as the world she had been forced into revealed its most violent and calculated side. The attack came swiftly, but thanks to her warning, it failed. Enemies were intercepted before reaching the penthouse, their plans dismantled with cold precision, yet the ordeal left her shaken. She had stepped willingly into danger, placed herself in harm's way, and realized the full extent of her bond to him. It was no longer fear alone that held her in the orbit of this man. It was trust, fragile and complicated, entwined with survival, necessity, and a strange, dangerous respect. In the quiet aftermath, she felt an unexpected sense of empowerment. She had acted, not out of obedience, but out of choice. That choice had saved him and secured her place at his side, not as a pawn, but as a participant in a world she had once feared. Now beginning to understand, the lines between fear, loyalty, and attachment blurred, leaving her in a suspended state where danger and connection existed side by side. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no returning to the life she had lost. Whispers began to circulate through the city, whispers that carried danger like smoke through the streets. Rival gangs had learned of her presence and began plotting to use her as leverage against him. Every shadow seemed to move with intent, every passerby a potential threat. She realized that her life had become a chess piece in a game far larger than she could comprehend. Fear returned, sharper and colder than before, because this time survival was not guaranteed by proximity. It depended on action, courage, and the choice she was about to make. She discovered the plot late one night while moving through the penthouse. A misdelivered message, an intercepted call, and fragments of conversation revealed the plan. She was to be kidnapped, used as a bargaining chip to strike at the heart of his empire. Her pulse raced, and she understood immediately that the danger was imminent. There was no time to hesitate, no safe corner to hide in. She could either escape and save herself, leaving him to face the wrath of his enemies, or warn him, stepping further into the world that had already ensnared her. Both choices carried lethal consequences, and she felt the weight of her life and his pressing down on her shoulders like stone. For hours she moved silently through the building, avoiding the guards, whose loyalty was unquestionable, yet whose presence now felt suffocating. Every step had to be calculated, precise. A misstep could cost her everything. Her mind raced as she debated the impossible choice, self-preservation or allegiance. In the end, instinct guided her. She could not allow the enemies to exploit her. She could not become the instrument of his downfall. She chose him. She chose to act. The warning she delivered was subtle yet enough. Through coded signals, hidden notes, and carefully arranged information, she alerted him to the imminent threat. The Mafia boss, known for his ruthless efficiency, immediately understood the danger. Within minutes, he mobilized his inner circle, preparing for the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in the penthouse. She watched from a hidden vantage point, her heart hammering, as the world she had been forced into revealed its most violent and calculated side. The attack came swiftly, but thanks to her warning it failed. Enemies were intercepted before reaching the penthouse, their plans dismantled with cold precision, yet the ordeal left her shaken. She had stepped willingly into danger, placed herself in harm's way, and realized the full extent of her bond to him. It was no longer fear alone that held her in the orbit of this man. It was trust, fragile and complicated, entwined with survival, necessity, and a strange, dangerous respect. In the quiet aftermath, she felt an unexpected sense of empowerment. She had acted, not out of obedience, but out of choice. That choice had saved him and secured her place at his side. Not as a pawn, but as a participant in a world she had once feared, now beginning to understand. The lines between fear, loyalty, and attachment blurred, leaving her in a suspended state where danger and connection existed side by side. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no returning to the life she had lost.